Welcome to a Homegrown Family Podcast, where we grow the produce and the kids. Hey everybody, this is the Homegrown Family Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Metler. Here we are talking about homegrown things and family things. And right here, I'll throw it in the beginning of the episode here, because not everybody listens to the very end. Follow me at Homegrown Fam on the Instagram. Email me at homegrownfam@gmail.com. Give me some insights, some thoughts and comments from everybody. It'd be great. Leave a rating, 5 stars. So anyways, here we go. If you listen to a previous episode of mine with our podcast guest, Vince, he's here with us again here today, college friend of mine, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Vince and his farm life and kind of go into a little bit more of what I call commercial farming versus small family farming versus like homesteading. And so I think a lot of my podcast listeners, all of you, are not necessarily of the commercial farming community, right? I think most of you that probably listen to this podcast are probably of the homesteading type, small acreage. You may have 20 acres of land, maybe just you're sitting on a little square etched out in a field that's about 10 acres large, and you have a garden of some sorts. That's just my hunch. Maybe you have some farmers listening, like Vince. But I would say that for the most part, most of you are pretty small scale when it comes to farming. Home gardeners and the sorts. If you recall, I grew up on a farm, 460 acres. We raised 30 head of cattle, had a handful of pigs and chickens, ducks, rabbits, sheep. We had a horse and a llama here and there. Charlie, if you remember that from previous episode also. The llama that rarely spit, but spit in the corn feed.
Oh, no.
To keep the cow from eating it.
That was smart.
I really didn't grow up on what people would call a commercial farm. Commercial farm, I'd say 5,000 plus acres and so forth. And you have your small family farm that has maybe no employees. That's maybe 5,000 or less acres and such. And then you have your homesteading type. I guess that's how I'd kind of categorize it here, I guess. We're going to get into that anyways. So, like I said in a previous episode, we have my friend Vince. We talked about some different college stories. Glad to have Vince back. Hopefully you all enjoyed him. Hey, leave a rating and a comment in the section, below or whatever if you enjoyed Vince and you want him back.
Thank you very much, Joe. It's great to be here again. I'm happy that I didn't scare you off the first time.
I'm looking forward to this. I always appreciate the conversation, Vince. And for those of you guys who are now clicking 1 star if you don't want to see Vince again, too bad, because he's back.
You have to just skip this episode.
Stick around. You'll love it. So in this episode, I want to talk a little bit more to you about Vince, about your experience farming. My experience is my experience, but you're maybe a little bit more of a larger scale than what my parents are. We had only 460 acres. And so why don't you go ahead and give us a broad overview of your farm and your family in general?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Joel. I think the big thing we'll start with is the clarification between a commercial farm, a family farm, and then a hobby farm, like you had already mentioned. Commercial farm, as you said, is probably 5,000 or more. We have multiple different employees, maybe even have several different families involved in the same operation. What we have, my dad and I, we farm together. It's just us two with some seasonal help from other family members. And that is about roughly 2,000 acres. So it's a good family-sized farm. Then you got the hobby farms that you mentioned, that maybe are, like you said, 500 or less acres, where they're raising a plethora of different, things, whether it be cattle or sheep, as you'd mentioned, or hogs. Chickens, goats, whatever.
Yeah, not really specialized in one particular thing.
Exactly. Yeah. So a little bit about my background is I'll be the 7th generation farmer in my family. And that dates all the way back to when my family originally came from the Czech Republic area over to the United States. I'll be the 3rd generation farmer on the current farm where we live now, my wife and I, or in the same areas where I grew up. On our farm, we raise corn, soybeans, wheat. And those are the big 3 crops that we raise. Try and do a third, and a third rotation, but depending upon the weather or the markets, we may tailor that a little bit. We may have a little bit more of one than the other. Trying to keep in mind the rotation of crops.
Yeah, and you mentioned the different types of crops that you grow. I'll draw a little bit of a comparison here because North Dakota, I would say, is probably the Napa Valley of the Midwest. Because California, everybody thinks of the citrus, your oranges, your pears, your cherries, all the leafy vegetables, your lettuces, and all that type of stuff. They have a great diversity over there in California, right? You get into the lower Midwest, the I states, corn, soybean. That's basically what you get. and then maybe something else thrown in there, but primarily corn and soybean. And then you have North Dakota is kind of split into like a wetter side of the state and a drier side of the state. And we are quite diverse. I think we're like number 1, 2, or 3 in wheat production, and durum wheat production and spring wheat production. We're number 1 in like chickpeas or something like that, I think. I should have really looked this up. I'll post something in the show notes showing what North Dakota's all the number 1 productions in, so you guys know. But we grow things like chickpea, dry beans, lentils, flax, canola. I think we're one of the top producers of canola in the United States as far as North Dakota goes. What other crops I missed?
Sunflowers, corn, soybeans, wheat, winter wheat. I mean, you can go on and on and on. Dry beans, edible beans of all different types, navies, pintos, kidney beans. Wow, there's a lot of different. I could probably think of 15 off the top of my head, Joe, like you'd mentioned. Honey. We're the number 1 producer of honey in the nation.
Yeah.
And people don't think of that as a crop. It is, absolutely.
Yeah, so North Dakota is a very diverse place to be growing things agriculturally. That's pretty cool. Just touting the North Dakota horn here a little bit, I guess. Minnesota, not quite so much. A little bit more moist in terms of their climate, and are more like corn, soybeans. You'll get more like alfalfa and dairies over in Minnesota. You get a little more pasture in there, that a little bit more seasonal rainfall that helps a lot with that type of situation. So, yeah, they grow trees. A lot more trees in North Dakota. One of the jokes that one of my friends always tell me about North Dakota is, and I don't know how many of you remember a previous episode with Jake and Michelle in homeschooling. Well, Jake, he'd always say to me, "Oh, you're from North Dakota because you can see your dog want to run away for days."
That's a good one.
So yeah, going back to Vince and your family farm, you guys did soybean, corn, and wheat. It's kind of primarily what you guys did.
Yep, absolutely.
And you mentioned crop rotation. So that's an important thing that we learned in school, and as a farming community, you kind of just know that it's very important to rotate your crops. Why would you not want to grow corn on corn on corn on corn, Vince?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you can apply it to wheat or soybeans or any of the other crops that we had mentioned. But the reason why you wouldn't grow corn on corn on corn on corn on corn is because it's a high nitrogen user. That means that it pulls a bunch of nutrients, not just nitrogen, from the ground. So it's very hard on it. It's taxing. So that'd be one of the main reasons. Chemical resistance. We can get into a little bit later too in this podcast, but chemical resistance is huge, right? Not so much on the corn side, but on the soybean side and the wheat side, we're seeing a lot of resistant weeds. And resistance is those weeds that you spray don't die. Mm-hmm. So those are some of the main reasons. And then to have a broadleaf and a grass growing, you get more benefits. One is a nitrogen fixer, like a legume. Yep, so the soybeans. So they actually help produce nitrogen for the next crop you're going to raise, which would usually be a grass, whether it be a cool season grass or a warm season grass, being corn or wheat for us.
Yeah. One other thing I kind of think about is especially in soybean, is that you can oftentimes get those molds on the white mold and things like that. And like sunflowers, you get your sclerotinia, and a lot of those things can be soil borne and live in the soil. So if you rotate your crops from a broadleaf to a grass or things like that, you reduce your disease incidence and break that disease cycle up. So that's one of the reasons for benefiting crop rotation also. And then you mentioned being a grass and a broadleaf crop difference is very important, because then it gives you a whole new window of different herbicides and chemical products that you could use if you choose to do so. In that, you can use a lot more wide-scale control of broadleafs in a wheat crop or a corn crop. Wheat crop, it's hard to use some of those grass-killing herbicides to control grassy weeds.
Yeah, it's always a big issue.
Yeah, so that's very important. That's something that farmers are well aware of. Sometimes I wonder about the I-states, the corn and soybean all the time, but that rotation does work, and those same benefits do arise in those situations too. We just like to see that third or fourth crop in there, just to really diversify and to utilize different components within the soil profile and things like that too. You may also rotate because you have a drier year expected. Corn's a heavy water user, and so you're saying, I want a grassy crop in the mix. I'm going to switch over to wheat instead of corn, or something like that. In my experience growing up on a farm, almost a ranch almost, we didn't do much for row crops or anything like that. So is it common to change the game plan based upon the seasonal outlook for your farm? Yeah,
absolutely, Joe. I think that's spot on. I mean, even some of the farmers that I know, you ask them, what are they going to raise? I don't know. It depends. What the weather's going to do. Is it going to be dry? Is it going to be wet? Is it going to be the markets are going to go up? The markets are going to go down? Yeah, those are strong, heavy dictators of. I mean, there are times where it may be just a few weeks before planting, and we've already booked some seed, and we're like, well, what are we going to do? I don't know. We'll see what the weather does. We kind of make the decisions on the go. So yeah, absolutely.
You should be planting next week, and you may change it up.
Yep.
Okay.
Absolutely. We can switch from corn to soybeans and wheat, right? Corn is obviously the longest season. It's a warm season grass. We want to get that in first along with the wheat because there's a cool season. So a lot of times we'll plant corn and wheat almost simultaneously.
Yeah, and if it's getting to be a spring that's really, really wet and you haven't gotten into the ground yet,
you don't have a lot of options. You switch to soybeans or dry beans for those that that can grow them. They'll switch to some other shorter season crop maturity than the long season corn. Or you could change varieties up to a certain point, right? So
yeah, and that's one of the things you can give props to the North Dakota farmers too, since they have such a selection of crops they could grow. They need all the different types of combine headers and all the different types of equipments for all these crops also. And so if somebody can't just say, hey, I'm going to grow lentils today if they don't particularly have the equipment for it. So farmers, they got to be diverse in their equipment as much as they are diverse in their crops too.
Yep, solid point.
Before we get too much more in depth about everything else, why don't you tell us a little bit about your family, and things like that? Like, you're obviously working on a farm with your dad.
Yep, absolutely. So it's just Dad and I who work on the farm. I'm married. I have 5 kids, so they're starting to become of age now where they're going to be useful on the farm. My oldest is 10, my youngest is 3, so I'm really looking forward to having those days where they could, be out in the tractor with me for a little longer time frame and even maybe learn how to do it themselves. So I grew up on a farm, as I mentioned, helped Dad all throughout high school, went to college. Dad told me that I couldn't go to the farm unless I got a 4-year degree, so I went to NDSU, which is where Joe and I met, and I'm so glad I did. It was one of the best experiences of my life. As mentioned in a previous episode, how many stories can we share? Joe, so many. So very grateful for that. Moved to Illinois, where my wife's from, for 3 years. Worked as an agronomist because, as Joe mentioned in a previous podcast, we both had crop and weed science majors. Then we came back to the farm in 2015, and we've been farming with my dad ever since. So going on that note, this will be my 9th year back in North Dakota.
Wow. Someone told me the other day that, Joe, you're only like a couple years away from your 20th high school reunion.
No way.
I'm like, wow.
You don't feel it.
I just aged me a little bit there. But we talked a little bit about the differences in the scale of farming. One thing I think is always interesting is that we have all these resistance issues with weeds, or in general, some mismanagement, right? Best management practices, right? BMP is what they preached at school and at college. And not all farmers do what's probably the best. And I think as a smaller family operation like yours, Vince, you can really take the time to go drive to every field. And you can take the time to plant in a timely manner. You're not mudding things in. You can take the time to say, hey, I can harvest a little bit today, a little bit tomorrow, get the moisture just right, so that way you don't have to dry it in your bins that much. So you can decrease your inputs and get the most ideal outputs. Some of the larger scale farmers, hire that out to agronomists or field scouts and things like that. And they're not quite as in. I'm sorry if I'm insulting any large farmers out there that are, growing 10,000 plus acres, but you can't tell me that you go and visit every acre. You would not have a time. And if you do, kudos to you.
Yeah.
If you manage to go out there and stay in tune with your farm and every acre, good job. But I'd say more often than not, the large commercial scale farmers, tend to use one single recipe, whether it be herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, whatever, one single recipe for all their acreage for that specific crop that they're growing. The recipe might be different for soybean than it is corn, but they may not tailor it to each piece of property. I don't know, Vince, so is that too far off?
No, I think that's a good summary of it, right? We don't want to just categorize everybody in one place, but yeah, I think by and large, the larger farmers that I could say that I maybe know a little bit more intricately hire a lot of those services out, whether that be fertilizing or spraying. Yeah.
Yeah, and so as a smaller farmer and family operation that Vince has here in his life, I think it probably more relates to a lot of my listeners in the homesteading type of thing. I mean, you have a little bit of homesteading type stuff that you do more intricately within your couple acre radius of your house. I think you have some chickens and such. Why don't you go ahead and briefly talk about that?
Yeah, just briefly. My wife and I live on 17 acres where we live right now, and we have goats and chickens and sheep. We also have house cats. Or not. We don't have house cats. We have farm cats. Yeah, we should keep that in there. We do not have house cats. That just came out way too quick. So where my wife and I live, we have 17 acres there, and on that 17 acres, we have goats and chickens and sheep, and then we have farm cats. So that's just in a nutshell kind of what we built a fence last fall. We hope to finish it this spring here and hopefully get maybe a milk cow.
Oh, nice.
So,
yeah, that's one thing that we have on our farm too. And probably have a separate episode on this whole process of how you go about milking a cow. I know a couple of different ways. My dad's just a bucket and some screens and a strainer.
That's what we're going to do.
I got my uncle who's got the whole little miniature
electronic milker.
Yeah, electronic milker. So it all depends on what you're doing and what you're interested in. And then there's definitely some components. You could talk to all about the whole benefits of raw milk versus pasteurized milk and all this type of stuff. And maybe one day we'll get into it. One of the things that in this day and age, that is a resource of plenty or is water. And it's getting less and less, available. We keep on building in deserts where there is none. Las Vegas. Sorry, Las Vegas, but all you got going for you is gambling, right?
I've never been, but that's what I've heard.
Anyway, I don't need to get on that rant either, but there are definitely some things in life that don't make sense to me. Building in a desert is one of those. But water management, and that kind of goes into some of the farming practices, and what are some of the things that you can do to conserve water or help mitigate a dry year or a wet year?
Okay, that's a great segue right into it. A lot of there's two ways there's three, traditional ways that I'm familiar with is no-tilling, conventional tilling, and strip tilling. And to just quickly go over those, no-tilling is literally you leave last year's crop, stubble, in the field. The next spring, you go in just with the planter and you put it into the ground. Conventional tillage is in the fall of the year, you plow the field over, whatever method of tillage you want to use. And then strip tilling is like conventional tilling, but instead of the whole field, you're just doing strips or rows where you're going to be planting the next year. So on our farm, we do a combination of no-tilling and conventional tilling. So a lot of times, like the corn and the wheat, we'll try and no-till as much as we can. There are wetter areas, lower lying ground that seem to hold water year after year after year, doesn't matter. And we will plow those over almost continuously, so every year. But some of more of the higher hills, we would no-till. And some of the benefits of no-tilling is you conserve moisture. You create more of an organic matter in the base, in the soil. You conserve the nutrients instead of turning the soil over and drying it out, right? It stays below ground. You invite worms to come and do the tilling for you underneath the soil. So there are a host of benefits for no-tilling. It does depend upon the year, though. Sometimes, like I mentioned, with the wet areas that we have, you just got to plow. Mm-hmm. You got to till up the ground to get it to dry out so you can plant. But by and large, we try and do as much no-till as possible. That helps with erosion. That helps with soil management of, as I mentioned, just the conserving water and the nutrients aren't continually being exposed to the air. It helps keeps weed seed at bay because you're not bringing new flushes of weed seeds that come up. I think I remember in college, Joe, weed seeds can be dormant for hundreds of, maybe even thousands of years, some species. It's really important to try and keep them at bay as most as you can.
Yeah, that might be a little bit on the high number possibly, but I know wild oats is one that's pretty prolific that can stay under 20 to 40 years at least. I think kochia is typically about a 5-year lifespan. And then your smaller seeds, like your red pigweeds and your water hemp and stuff like that might be 2 to 3 years, depending on conditions. If it's hotter and they're sitting there baking without germinating or something like that, it's all plays a factor. But in general, the larger seeds typically last longer, and the smaller seeds don't last as long. One thing you mentioned too was you mentioned the weeds kind of being on the surface, or in like a no-till situation. But you're also like, if there's weeds that come and lay their seeds on the ground, you don't till it. It's there for the mice. It's there for the birds. That might be considered a sterile seed bed technique. That I learned in plant ecology and biology, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so that helps also. But say if you have problematic weeds, like if you have just a flush red pigweed or palm rust, just, oh man, it's getting to you, and you're no-tilling it, well, it might be good to go back to the traditional plow and bury that seed 6 inches under and start fresh. That can also be a mechanism or a technique to help battle some of those weeds and things. I mean, there's many different things, and part of the goals of this episode is to say, hey, not all commercial farmers just go out there and plow everything under and spray whatever they want whenever they want and cause, driftable fines for us to all breathe in and all this stuff. Farmers get a bad rap sometimes. And part of this episode is I just want to let my listeners know that, farmers like Vince, take good care. They're properly trained with a pesticide applicator's license. Take annual trainings for the more restricted use pesticides, like the CAM and paraquat. They're very good stewards of the land, and so I just want to really emphasize that in this episode. Even though you think, that glyphosate might be the devil or something like that, it's not always the case. And we can talk about that a little bit too here, I guess, Vince, if you'd like, in terms of just, the difference between maybe conventional farming and organic farming. If we can get into that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So organic farming is basically, I'm not going to use a single herbicide that could jeopardize the potential risk of getting into the human body, right? So I'm going to be using things like heat. I know people use flamethrowers to kill the weeds because if you get the weeds hot enough, they'll basically cook themselves to death.
Yeah.
I know people who use electricity, right? They have an electric wire that they run above the crop, and any weed that is above that, when it hits it, they get zapped.
Conventional farmers can sometimes use that as well for their weed escapes too.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
You can always do a combination of everything.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. But organic, they just focus on using not synthetic herbicides or fertilizers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they might use things like sulfur to help combat bacterial diseases.
Yeah, chicken manure for nitrogen, something like that from an organic
Sometimes
farm.
Fish guts, I've heard.
Yeah, I believe it.
And don't get me wrong, that's what people interpret organic farming to be. There's a list of like 100 different products that can be used. You can find it on the USDA website. Maybe I'll post out a link to that here. That, hey, these are all the list of things that are considered organic.
Right. And
it's what we interpret, what the legislature, the EPA interprets as organic. And sometimes what's listed there, I question. Is this really truly organic? And so don't always believe what the perception of organic to be. I'm critical of both parties here. I'm critical of the organic that believe people, that say they're organic, but they're spraying other things that are on the organic list, but that I'm like, yeah, okay. And then the same thing goes for those who are conventional. I don't think you should go out there and spraying your crop 10 times a year, I just had this conversation the other day about potatoes. You can go buy a bag of potatoes for $3.50, 10-pound or 5-pound sack or whatever. Or you can grow them in your yard. They take up a lot of space in my garden. I'm like, yeah, I'd almost prefer to buy the potatoes. But then when you realize how many times that's sprayed with fungicide and how many times it's got to be a half dozen applications or so at least. And so I'm like, gosh, maybe I should just grow my own potatoes. Vince mentioned, I think, prior to this episode, Honey Nut Cheerios, how glyphosate can now actually be found in, you can't deny it, that it's been found in Honey Nut Cheerios, right? In other foods. Kind of in the defense side of that, I guess, farmers, when they grow their crops, they're not intending on putting these herbicides out there. And oftentimes, the testing has been done and approved by the EPA and other research entities that when they tested the grain, it came below a certain threshold that determined it was not harmful, with that product, that chemistry, or glyphosate in this instance per se. And I don't want to get into a big glyphosate debate here, but so it was considered safe, right? And then you grind it up, make a flour out of it to make your Cheerios. Well, it probably concentrated the amount of glyphosate per, milligram or whatever it is. But so I don't know about you, Vince, but I'm critical of both sides. When I hear stories about glyphosate, in certain products, I'm like, okay, well, you know what? I'm probably going to avoid those products, those things. Organic lettuce, gosh, I don't know if I'd eat organic lettuce. I've worked on an organic farm with lettuce, and you get a fair amount of bugs in your bag, I think. The other day I heard my coworker said that he got a bag of lettuce from, I'm not going to say where. And he said he found a mouse in it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh my
I was like, are you kidding? It probably wasn't organic or anything, but he said he found a mouse in his bag.
Oh.
And I was like, wow. So anyways, yeah, there's different things there that make me think. Just critically think for yourselves, I guess, too. But
I'm going to chime in just on what you said, Joe. I think you did a good job of just saying, hey, we're going to kind of try and stay neutral, right? I know people who farm organic and they only eat conventional food. I know people who farm conventionally, right, and they eat only organic food. It can go both ways. And I think without getting into it a lot, yeah, the good way to say it is that, yeah, just be conscious of the food that you buy and where you're getting it from. It's really important to know where your source of your food comes from, right? Us in agriculture, I think you did a great job of summing up a small family farm like myself, right? We care about the stewardship of the land, right? So we want to leave it better for the next generation than when we got it. So when we're out there and we're doing soil samples and we're checking our levels and we're seeing what we need to add, what we need to take away, what rotation we need to go through, what type of weeds are present, How do we mitigate those, as you had mentioned? What kind of tillage methods are we going to use, right? All those things are factored into it. And then also thinking about the next generation, right? So I want to pass this farm on that I've been given to my sons, and hopefully, God willing, their sons, right? But that's got to be their choice, and they've got to want to do it. I'm not going to force them to, but I would love that. Yes. So when we talk about, you mentioned, organic and just the glyphosate issue, yeah, that's a hot topic that's going on in the world right now. I think do the research yourself and make the decision, that best fits your family. Mm-hmm. Because there are people on both sides.
Great. I want to sort of round it back here a little bit. We talked a little bit about water management. You mentioned these different types of tillage. And that's one method of being able to be stewards of the land, but there's many other things that you can do to, help conserve water, or help yourself manage the land. And, some of that can be like cover crops. Sometimes farmers, they'll grow a crop like a winter wheat, and then they might grow into soybeans if they have a long enough season to do 2 crops. Or you might do soybeans and then plant winter wheat, or just, a clover cover crop or something like that to kind of help preserve, water, to help limit soil erosion, so that we have some ground cover. And that ground cover will then help conserve moisture in the spring, and just many different things that people can do. And one of the things I kind of see as I drive down the road, I see in the Red River Valley and a lot of other places, people put in tile. I think the tile goes down like 3 feet below. Is that about right, Vince? I don't know if you have any tile.
No, we don't have any tile on our farm specifically, but yeah, that's a pretty steady number, is 3 feet down, 36 inches.
Yeah.
Or so.
So I think, you got these pipes or corrugated tubes that go down 3 feet into the soil, so they're out of your, tillage zone or things like that. And so as the water slowly drains and once it hits that, that tube, it'll drain really fast and help move water off the property or off the land. And this is maybe mostly I'm talking about this probably because I'm talking about or briefly touching on topics of high interest, I guess. But for me, I drive past these areas that have this drainage tile, and I'm like, gosh, these farmers are spending all this money on this stuff. And I'm kind of like, if the farm or the land is too wet to get into naturally, I'm like, why spend the money and tile it? It should probably be a wetland, or it should probably be planted into trees or to something to be more environmentally friendly, rather than pushing the water off to your neighbor or pushing the water off into the slough. I mean, the whole entire soil profile acts as a big filtration system. And so if it goes down, 100 feet, filters through the soil until it hits the groundwater, right? Rather than 3 feet down, let's go into the stream and pass the nitrates on to somebody else. That's one thing that I wish farmers would be more stewards of the environment sometimes, and not just their own agricultural property. I don't know. What do you have thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Nope. I mean, we have all this natural drain on our fields. Like you said, we have some area that's wet that we have to continually till. We've looked at putting it in something like CRP. We've looked at putting it into something like a wetland management area where, hey, they can be of use. We can still get a little bit of money out of it, right? Because that's the goal of why anybody has a job, is to get a little bit of money. And then, but at the same time, yes, you're being a better steward of the ground. They're really cracking down, the EPA, on runoff. How much is going into the water that we consume? How much of it is just going into the streams, the lakes, then eventually being filtered out through the entire nation? So that's a good point you made there. Yeah, you get 3 feet down versus 100 feet if that's where the water is, and how much it wasn't filtered. Well, there's going to be a high concentration of more likely herbicides.
Yeah, or fertilizers.
Yep, or fertilizers.
Yep. Things like that.
Fungicides. Yep. It all ties together. So great point. Not that tiling is bad, but it has its uses.
Yep. Yeah, and in North Dakota, you gotta give them some credit that it is really, really flat. And so oftentimes if you are, tiling off someplace, it will go into, some kind of slough and eventually percolate through the soil still. I think we just also got to be considerate of, the wildlife and things like that and whatnot. So anyways, there's many things that, both organic and conventional things could do better. And farming is as much of a science as it is an art, as it is a way of living. We wouldn't be able to live without our farmers. So,
thanks, Joe.
Yeah. But yeah, so that was kind of my goal. This episode was kind of shed some light on, the commercial farmer, a small family farmer. Buy local when you can, right, Vince?
Absolutely.
One thing I kind of also wanted to mention too, I guess, to kind of wrap this episode up, is that as the small family farms are getting less and less, whether it's because the kids don't want to farm, or they don't have anybody to pass the farm on to, as your dad, Vince, gets older, say if you didn't want to farm and you stayed in Illinois, was it? Who would you be passing the farm on to? Some, big commercial farmer may have come up and buy a property, and next thing you know, it's not going to be cared for as well as you did. Or it's going to be bought by somebody who wants to have a big hunting party. I hunt. I'm pro hunt. It's harder to get into agriculture unless you're born into it. And so,
yeah.
There's probably farms out there. I read an article one day out of this magazine saying that this farmer was looking for somebody to pass the farm on to, couldn't find anybody. Went to the local government, and the government tried to pair match up by putting out applicants, and then they had a bunch of interviews, and eventually they found this couple that was wanting to farm, and it's like, okay, well, I'm not really quite ready to be done farming yet, but we came to some kind of agreement where the guy would still kind of help as a hired hand. They learn from each other, and that's part of it. It's like, if you're not in farming, you can't buy all the equipment. A combine costs, what, $300,000 plus?
Yep. The new ones, if you get the John Deere X Series, they're $1 million. If you price out all the options, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, and they're coming out with technologies these days that shoots lasers at weed stems and kills the weeds. Well, that's another expense to be able to buy this equipment. Yeah, it's precision ag, and it's helping us not use as many pesticides, not use as many herbicides, and things like that. But the ag is definitely agriculture is being developed more and more to help suit the needs of everybody. So, yeah. Anything else, Vince, to wrap up?
Nope. I think you did a good job, Joe.
Don't want to get on a segue here. Catch me on coffee sometime. Or shoot me an email if you got a particular topic you want me to touch on at homegrownpam@gmail.com. And if you're interested in hearing more about my opinions about it, if I get enough interest, maybe I'll do that. All right. Take care, everybody.